Welcome to another episode of the Patio Pondering Podcast. Today is another solo episode. I'm recording this on January 12th, 2026, just ahead of the Fort Wayne Farm Show. Several things have happened the last few days since I did my last episode. First of all, I finished book work for the most part. Then I had a USDA report today. Through all that, there's a thought that just stuck in my head. It's a memory that I have, and I don't know why I have that memory. And that memory comes from 1978 of me and my grandfather, Roy Baker, sitting on the tailgate of his Ford F-150. It was green, manual transmission, 3 on the floor. And he and I were sitting at what we call Grandpa May's farm. And we were parked on top of what was the remnants of the hip roof barn that was on Grandpa May's farm. It had been buried because an arsonist burned it down. I don't know why I remember this, but it has stuck with me. He said, Jimmy, he always called me Jimmy, my whole family called me Jimmy, and he was wearing his hickory stripe Oshkosh Bagosh overalls, and he said, Jimmy, don't ever get into farming. There's no money in it. It was 1978. I was 7 years old. I didn't give a hoot about the money. I was more worried about the cool tractors and getting a ride in the combine with his renter Chuck Arnett. Or going to the Defiance County Fair and seeing the displays, whether it was International Harvest from Deckers or the case display from Camps, the big blue Ford four-wheel drive, which is a rebadged Steiger from Spangler's and Bryan, or the John Deere owl cabs that were displayed from Leakey's and Edgerton. I mean, that was the cool stuff to me. It wasn't money. I mean, farming wasn't money. What? You didn't need money to farm. It's just driving tractors around having fun. At least that's what it was to a 7-year-old in 1978. Now, here's why that sentence, that memory, those comments from my hickory stripe-clad grandfather were so important, and why they matter to me in 2026 is because after my mother died, I understood better where my grandfather was coming from. So if we back up from 1978 to 1901, when my great-grandparents bought 55 acres of poorly drained, hilly, wet ground in Newville Township of DeKalb County, they had no money. So they had to borrow $500 from the neighbor lady, Melissa Kelly. Now, Melissa Kelly married into a fairly prominent family there on the state line there between DeKalb and Allen County, and she was a Scoville. And Scoville still owned ground there in north of us. John is the keeper of the cemetery and still owns farm ground. So borrowing money from Melissa Kelly was a big deal. My poor great-grandparents bought this farm. My grandfather was born there. They lost 2 children on that farm, and they scraped together to make money. Now, fast forward from 1902 to 1939. My grandparents had just gotten married around Christmas time, 1938. My great-grandmother had died in a car wreck north of Hicksville earlier in December 1938. And my grandparents, Roy and Violet, were living in this farm, this house that my grandfather had grown up in. And they were farming the estate farm because it hadn't been settled, because it was my grandfather, his 3 living brothers, and his stepdad that had left, and now my grandparents were living in this farm. I did not know this until going through the files that my grandmother saved. My grandparents filed paperwork with the USDA for assistance. Now, I don't know what program it was. I can't find the paperwork right now. But they filled out farm income. And between the crops that they planned to grow, crops that they were going to feed to the cows they were milking, and what they were going to sell, the cream, the milk, calves, chickens, and eggs that my grandmother raised, they projected a profit on the farm of $12.35. I just spent $11 and some odd cents to buy a Baconator meal at Wendy's. In 1939, $12.35 projected farm profit? You couldn't wad a shotgun with that, as my mother would say. Think about it. 1902, 1901. Had to borrow $500 to buy a farm. 1939 projected $12.35 profit. I don't know how my grandfather got the loan with that kind of projection to buy his 1940 Farmall B with the exhaust lift cultivators from the international dealer in Hicksville. It was a 3-year note that he paid off that it had to be subsidized by his job at General Electric and my grandmother's teaching salary. So it's no brainer to me now that my grandfather said there's no money in farming in 1978 when it should be just gangbusters. Add to the story. Grandpa May's farm was originally purchased by my great-great-great-grandfather in 1855 when they came to Concord Township from Ohio. William Christ died unexpectedly in 1909, and his daughters inherited it along with his wife. One of the daughters and her husband bought the farm. Literally, not figuratively, but they purchased the farm. They had 2 children that didn't survive, and in 1935, the life insurance company that held the mortgage finally foreclosed when they couldn't make I don't remember how big the mortgage payment was. And after the legal ramblings that happened in the Depression, they finally had to vacate the property. And when they vacated the property, my great-grandfather moved in. And that's why it became Grandpa May's farm. Well, Grandpa May, as my mother would say her entire life, was a very trusting soul. And because he was a trusting soul, he got into some financial dealings that hurt him. Lost a farm or 2 and had people come after him for loans on cars that he co-signed for. So Grandpa May jumped in his farm and he was going to buy it. And I found the letter from the life insurance company to my great-grandfather May saying, "Mr. May, thank you for your application for mortgage. Unfortunately, because of outstanding warrants for payment against you, we will not be able to offer a mortgage for you to purchase the 120 acres you now rent." That could have been the end of the story. But my grandmother jumped in and said, "Okay, Dad, I'll buy it." So this is 1937. She was a single woman. She was a teacher and had gone to Ball State University. So she was a unicorn in that she had a 4-year degree and a teacher. So she bought it. And I found the correspondences and her diary about that farm. And the correspondences that I have several of read something like this. "Ms. May, we are contacting you to inquire when we will receive payment that is several weeks in arrears for the mortgage on blankety blank farm." Or, "Ms. May, we are in receipt of your letter dated X saying that you will send payment. We happily expect that payment from you." Those letters are side by side with diary entries where my grandmother wrote in her elegant cursive handwriting, "Dad walked pigs to St. Joe for mortgage payment." Or, "Waiting for check from the retirement fund for money to pay mortgage." So my grandparents knew what it meant to struggle to farm. See, my great-grandfather, Grandpa May, on his farm, the 120 acres, he farmed it. He had hogs and he had crops. And they still scraped to make a mortgage payment, even though they got a hell of a deal on that farm because it was a foreclosure. Fast forward to 2026, looking through those books and realizing that I got a lot of money from the USDA this past year. We had ECAP, SDRP, and then I got a little bit for ARC for some soybeans. That we're still struggling from a profit standpoint on the farm. Oh, thank goodness we don't have to rely upon the farm for all of our household income. But there's a thread a consistent thread from 1902 to 1938 to 1978 and to 2026. And that thread is a very thin thread. And that is, profits in farming have always been tenuous and fleeting. Thinking back to my youth, climbing on those tractors at the Defiance County Fair and how cool they were, even then, even through that boom time, we were right on the cusp of profits in farming becoming gone. Then you add to today the fireworks that came from the USDA report with the WASDE, World Agricultural Supply Demand Estimates, and the crop production report released at noon that said we had not only the largest acreage of corn ever, we also had the most bushels ever harvested. Those two things combined at the end of the day with trading took over $2 billion worth of equity out of the U.S. farmers' hands. Talk about profit going poof. So, as we sit here thinking about all I've talked about, the history of my family and the farms, the struggles that my family had, the realization from my grandparents in the early 1940s that, hey, this ain't going to work. I'm just going to work and you're going to work and we'll just have somebody else farm this. To watching the aftermath of the late 70s and the people that lost ground, lost farms, lost their lives because profitability went poof. To my books in 2025 and watching the reaction to the market today with more profits going poof. I guess if you think about that 124 year span between my great grandparents purchasing that 55 acres of wet farm ground in Newville Township, DeKalb County, Indiana, to the January crop report in 2026, what has actually changed? I would contend that not much has changed, except the number of zeros that we're dealing with.